Isn't it always?
It is. They've already kicked me out once, but the reason why, oh, my hair's all messed up too. I just come in, it's windy outside and my hair's like a mess. I just turned on the rumble. I'm like, oh, who is that? My husband just left for his first Friday downtown car show, and the dogs are out on the back porch with the door open, so they will be running in and out. So I apologize up front if you hear the crazy machination of two puppies. Okay. I do have a couple of things I want to talk about at the end. I want to keep the book stuff to the beginning, and then we will add. You want to go ahead and give? Oh, I guess I have to do that. I'll give her the co-host. There's a couple of things that I want to talk about. One of which, Bridget, if you'll remind me, is the True the Vote post. I definitely want to talk about that at the end. Okay. All right. So starting off, chapter 22, the Fatwa and Richard Helms. Again, this book is based on material from CIA agents, and it was their view that cozying up to totalitarian regimes in the Persian Gulf, that the U.S. had basically turned its back on many of the people in the United States, basically for oil profits. The intended effect of the policy was to produce cheap oil for import while basically not using our own. And they felt like that projected an image of the United States around the world that wasn't necessarily a healthy one. And of course, their assumption was that we didn't really care what other people thought because we had the biggest guns. We used them, and basically in very oppressive ways. When the management of any opposition that came our way potentially got in the way, that it would provide problems for us. So, okay, so Hugo did make it. All right, I'd never heard whether or not he got confirmed. So thanks for letting me know that he's here. Hugo, welcome to the show. If you would like to take a couple of seconds and introduce yourself to the audience, because a lot of people may not know your background.
Hi, I'm Hugo Turner. I'm a researcher. I've been doing a blog for around 10 years. I started right when the first Ukraine civil war started back in 2014. And I've been doing, since the Russian invasion, I've been doing a 3 or 4 year project on Ukraine, doing the history of the OUN from their origin through World War II, through their use by the CIA during the Cold War and MI6, their influence in Canada, America, Australia, and I should finish that next year. And generally, I focus on CIA-related topics and the CIA and drugs, the CIA fascism, and and all covert wars in general, counterinsurgency, that kind of thing. And I've written, I think around 100 articles.
So, did you get a chance to look at any of the stuff that we've been researching?
I haven't been able to listen in because I just have an iPad usually. So.
Well, not just.
Yes, I did. But what kind of? I know you guys have been studying Gladio, basically, in different countries.
So, yes, And most people are unaware that the generic use of the term gladio dealing with the CIA as it relates to regime change, fascism, the World Anti-Communist League, and how all of that plays into the original origins of them wanting to basically implement their long-term plan being one world government. That's kind of we have a very wide focus on looking at the apparatus that they use, such as the NGOs, the nonprofits, the National Endowment for Democracy, and that type of thing. So, can you give us, since your specialty is Ukraine, um, can you give us what you believe the relevant points for a common person today to understand about their history?
Um, just on Ukraine, it's sort of the controversial topic. It's sort of like basically there's never a country called Ukraine in history until after World War One, and really it was sort of a part of Russia that was conquered by Poland and gradually developed its own sort of national identity only in the late 19th century. And this was sort of a time in Europe where everyone just went crazy with nationalism, and the Ukrainians were like, we're a separate nation. Really, it's kind of a Russian dialect, but you're not really allowed to say that. So basically, they after World War One, they briefly had an attempt. They had two separate Ukraines. They had a West Ukraine and a Ukrainian People's Republic, which is sort of like the part that was under Russia, because the part of present-day Ukraine was always divided between first Poland and Russia, and then later the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russia. And so, but after World War One, so at the start of World War One, part of Ukraine was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The rest of it was considered just part of Russia. It was called Little Russia, Malo Russia. And so, after these republics failed, basically they declared independence, and then they became a German puppet state. And then when Germany lost the war, they briefly fought against the Soviets. And then the White Russians were also fighting in Ukraine. The Western, like France, was occupying Odessa, and there was this attempt to create this sort of independent Ukraine, but it failed. And most of Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union, and the rest became part of Poland. The part that's in Poland is where the OUN was created, and it basically, after the failure to create a state, they created this organization called the UVO, the Ukrainian Military Organization, and then which was a terrorist group that spied for Germany and was attacking the Poles, and because they lost the war to Western Ukraine, lost the war to Poland basically, and so Galicia became part of Poland, and the part that was part of Russia, Volhynia, became part of Poland. So basically, they sided with the Nazis against the Germans and against the Soviets. They became like radicalized. There was this philosopher that they followed, Dmitry Dovtsov, who's very like a sort of Nietzschean kind of do everything for the Ukrainian state. Morality is just throw it out the window. All that matters is power. And so in 1929, they founded the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists to fight for like an independent fascist Ukraine. And eventually the younger generation under Stephen Bandera split from the older generation that had like fought in World War One, and they formed the OUNB. And the founder of the OUN had been like assassinated by the Soviets. So the old timers were taken over by the OUNM, basically Bandera, Andrei Melnik. So Bandera told Melnik to resign and like let him lead it. Melnik refused, and so it was split basically. So the OUNM was also fighting the OUNB. They were both competing for German support. And basically, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, they both came along with Germany, and they had many supporters in Poland and Galicia and Volhynia who were quick to join their movement, and basically they carried out a genocide against Jews, against Poles, against Russians, and were like incorporated the German military intelligence. It also had formed ties with MI6 before this. And so when the Nazis lost the war, they found a new sponsor in America and the British, because now the enemy was the Soviet Union. And so for most people would think that World War II ended in 1945, but for Ukraine, it continued until 1950, and even until in like a lower intensity. Like there's only like hundreds of these UPA units left by that point, but I mean hundreds of members, but the war didn't really end until 1953. Anyways, another important fact about this is that during the war, the OUB formed this organization called the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. And so like a lot of times it's just the Soviets and like other people would refer to them as the OUN UPA or OUN UPA, as the Ukrainians said. And they conducted this massive genocide against the Poles of Volhynia and Galicia to try to force them to flee so that they could take this territory after the war. They ended up getting this territory anyways because it's part of the Soviets. At the end of the war, they Poland was a puppet state, so they created this arrangement where Poland would get the eastern part of Germany, and Ukraine would get the eastern part of Poland, Galicia, and Ukraine was unified under the Soviet Union and became part of the Soviet Republic of Ukraine. So basically, the West is funding these Ukrainian nationalists in this 8-year war behind enemy lines. It's always omitted from any kind of Cold War history. You always hear about how like the Soviets imposed these communist governments in Eastern Europe, which is true, but you never hear about how the West was actually supporting these covert wars in like many of these Eastern European countries using these former Nazi collaborator groups.
And and Hugo, if I may, just because we do talk a lot about Operation Gladio and the stay behind units, it's my understanding from our research that there were a lot of that stay behind unit construct when the Nazis were originally coming through Ukraine during World War II. Is that what your research has shown as well?
Oh yeah, they had their own network in Galicia and Volhynia when the Nazis came through, because even though like the Soviets came to in 1939 as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, but they still had their underground members that were like ready to, they were supporters, and so as soon as it was safe to come out of hiding and like openly be OUNB, they were ready. So yeah, they had this underground stay behind network, and yes, the Ukrainians are very much linked to this Gladio thing because they served as the German stay behinds in like after Germany was kicked out of Ukraine.
Yes.
They were still supporting the UPA to fight against the Soviets, and they're like flying in arms and stuff. And then after the Germany was defeated, the British just sort of took it over, and then eventually the Americans took it over, and they were like parachuting OUN members into Ukraine, and dropping arms, dropping money, dropping guns. They assassinated 30,000 Soviet officials. Frank Wisner bragged. That's probably not true, but they did. I think they did like 15,000 or so, and a lot of the victims were just sort of Ukrainian peasants who, they were like, you cannot obey the Soviet authorities or you become the enemy, and it's very dangerous, obviously, to rebel against the Soviet authorities. So eventually, the people, even though they supported them in their hearts, the people of Western Ukraine had to kind of go with reality and stop supporting the OUB, or they would get deported or killed.
And so for complicity sake, if you were to look at modern day Ukraine, it would be fair to say that it historically had been basically Poland and Russia, and that the nationalistic people inside of Ukraine that wanted their own country in many ways took advantage of the world wars in order to try to make their case and create a country where none had existed before. Is that a fair
Yeah,
assessment?
that's pretty much, yeah, definitely. And
Eh,
well, of course,
Go ahead.
Poland was carved up in the 18th century, so it was carved up between Russia, Germany, and Austro-Hungary, and so that's why Austro-Hungary had the part that later became, after World War One, Poland became a state. That's why I've become very interested in World War One, because all these Eastern European countries were carved out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then earlier they've been carved out of Turkey and stuff. I find that kind of fascinating. So you don't learn anything about Eastern Europe in school or in college, even, unless you specifically go to a college that has a specialty program or something, which I didn't.
And Hugo, you make an interesting point because they basically and I'm a very basic person when it comes to concepts. It seems to me, based on my research of World War One and understanding that the Fabian Society told us well in advance in the 1800s that we were going to have three wars that would basically change the entire world into one world government. And the First World War did exactly what you just said. It carved up um, Europe, Eastern Europe, all the way through Russia. And then the World War II, you find in the aftermath of it, all of what we call fake countries like Taiwan and, soon to be the Kurdistan goes away, and you end up with reformed Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And so it's basically just the reshuffling of human populations. But interestingly enough, especially in Europe, it created fault lines that led to further mass casualty events slash wars, which seems to be the preferred way these people like dealing with the chaos and terror is through warfare in the military industrial complex.
Yeah, well, I'm more of a, like, I would see what you would call one world government as, say, the British Empire and then later the American Empire. Like, they want to control the whole world, and they use this idea that it would be like equitably around everything. But if it had been brought to, if they'd got their way, it would have been, controlled from London, and now it would be controlled from DC. And it's just sort of the rules-based international order, as they would call it, or the New World Order, as they called it after the Soviet Union fell. Or, I call it empire, but
And you're
essentially, yes, I would say the British plan kind of World War One so that they could knock out their biggest rival, Germany, and that they form these alliances, and that they just sort of pretend like these things just happened, but they were planning. World War II, they were like building up Germany to destroy the Soviet Union, but then it became too much of a threat to the British Empire too, so that America had to join the Soviet Union, their actual enemy, against Nazi Germany. And then after that, they went immediately back to hating the Soviets and then allying with the former Nazis. And of course, I'm sure you've heard that like Churchill had to drop this plan where they were going to like arm all the Germans at the end of World War II and invade the Soviet Union, but it wasn't practical because the Soviets had too many tanks and so on.
Well, yeah, the whole end of World War II was a very interesting transition. But I've also, and it's interesting that you use those words, the American Empire, because in Cynthia Chung's book, she talks about how the Fabian Society used the terms Pan America, which basically is the same thing that you just referred to as American Empire, which would have been all of basically the Americas. And then you had the British Empire, and you also had what was going to be a European empire once everyone got into their proper place. And then you were going to have an Asian empire. And this basically was going to form a round table of collusion on running the world according to their plan.
Oh yeah, I've read like I'm blanking on the Anglo, blanking on the name of like the Anglo. Oh, Carol Quigley and like the Anglo.
Yes, that's another version. Yep. And so back to Ukraine, because I find the information fascinating. What was your biggest takeaway in contrasting all of the information that you just provided because of course the OUN and all of those entities, to include the origins of the Azov and right sector, all trace themselves right back to everything that you just talked about. And that's modern day Ukraine.
Yes, and Ukraine, everybody knows about who Steven Bandera is. On every Azov group, every fascist group in Ukraine wants to. They call it. They want to portray themselves as the heirs of the OUN UPA, and so basically, the part I didn't get to talk about was that tens of thousands of these OUN members moved to Canada, Australia, and the US during the Cold War, where they became sort of like this Ukrainian think tanks. And they were also allied with all the other fascist collaborators through this part of the World Communist League that was called the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations. So they were allied with the former Arrow Cross people from Hungary, the Iron Cross people from Romania. Basically, every country that allied with Hitler had its own kind of fascist armed movement, and they all fled at the Soviets after the war, and they all settled in the West. And so when even before the Soviet Union fell, they were used to try to promote the idea that Stepan Bandera was a hero and all this stuff inside the Soviet Union through this Prologue Research Corporation, which was a splinter group off the OUNB led by Nicole Labed, who had headed the OUNB intelligence wing, the SB. And the modern Ukraine intelligence is called SBU. So it's actually named after the OUNB's intelligence. So they actually say, like, we need to adopt the tactics of the OUN UPA in order to battle. This is even before 2022. We need to use this to battle our enemies. And so basically, U.S. continued to use these groups, and then in 2014, during this color revolution, all these groups were mobilized to violently overthrow the government because in 2004, there had been this earlier color revolution, which was sort of nonviolent. These people took part in it, but like it didn't get out of hand. But then eventually, Yanukovych, in order to prevent Yanukovych from getting elected, and claiming the election was stolen, and so eventually their candidate was put in power. But then he became so a pro-American candidate. I can't believe I'm like this guy's name. Anyways, he declared Stepan Bandera a hero of Ukraine and like started making the OUN version of history like the official version of Ukraine. And so he became unpopular just because of like economic problems, and Yushchenko. So anyways, Yanukovych ended up winning the election anyways in 2010. So in 2014, they wanted to make sure that Ukraine would be forever changed by the Maidan Revolution. So instead of just having this normal kind of nonviolent color revolution involving NGOs and protesters, they like had thousands of these Nazi paramilitaries taking part in it. It got all bloody. It ended up provoking a civil war. All the people that were like Yanukovych's base of support in Donetsk was split off from Ukraine because they were so frightened by like the Ukrainian fascists that they brought to power by the Maidan, that they imitated basically what these Ukrainian opposition groups had done when they seized weapons and formed separatist republics, and the Russians decided to support them in order to like gain leverage over Ukraine. And they ended up beating the Ukrainian army with Russia's help, and then the conflict was frozen, but Ukraine refused to put in the peace deal, which is what led to the Russian invasion, basically. That brings us up to today, where the NATO is flooding Ukraine with weapons in a war that they know Ukraine can't win, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are going to end up dying in this failed attempt to stop Russia without like direct NATO involvement. We hope, because this could lead to World War III. I mean, if you've been following the war, it's always like there's one more thing we need. It's like first we need tanks, and it's like we don't want to send tanks, and then they end sending them. Then it was like the F-16s, the HIMARS, and right now it's like they want Tomahawk cruise missiles and nuclear weapons. Basically, they've already got permission to fire long-range missiles into Russia, and that's what they want next is tomahawk missiles and nuclear weapons, which obviously is dangerous. It's an understatement.
So can I just I want to go back. You said so much. I want to focus a little bit on the transition from the prior Nazis to the current Nazis, if I can. We just finished, or I'm in the middle of a segment with Alpha Warrior in talking about the World Anti-Communist League and its role in everything that you just said. The Stetsko in Ukraine and Heifer in Croatia and Siuntu in Romania. You just discussed all of them. And of course, they did create the ABN faction of the World Anti-Communist League. And then you had the Asian version of that with Sasakawa and Kudama and Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, Park in Korea. And it basically forms this worldwide network of fascist dictators. And in the cases of Eastern Europe, because they were kicked out of their country for things like skinning babies alive. I mean, the crimes that they committed in Eastern Europe was horrendous. The amount of people that they murdered. And so when the Soviets did occupy the Eastern European countries, and I'm not a communist sympathizer, I'm just stating facts. These people, some of which came to America as priests, as you just mentioned, they were basically dispersed through Canada, Australia, and into the United States. And they kind of morphed themselves into a veneer of acceptability when in fact they were all war criminals.
Absolutely. But you couldn't say that, or else you'd be accused of being a communist, or today you'd be accused of being like a Putinist. You just sort of shut down debate. And it's like, no, they're freedom fighters. and like, literally, America has celebrated this week called Captive Nations Week every year. It was like a nationwide thing where these Nazi collaborators were being publicized as freedom fighters, and you know, they're riding on a train with like the Liberty Bell, like waving the American flag, and it's like, no, these are like fascists. They're not Democrats. They don't love freedom.
Well, but isn't that exactly what we did with the Contras? We called them freedom fighters, and they were terrorists.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it seems to be a habit that we have, specifically in anything.
And it's, of course, that's actually where I got into the World Anti-Communist League, was through my interest in it. I read Contra, and I was reading this Peter Dale Scott book called, I think Ryan Contra Connection or something like that. Anyways, he talked a lot about the World Anti-Communist League, and I had reread this book right before the Ukraine thing popped off.
And what book was that?
Communist League. It's called the Iran Contra Connection, Secret Teams, and Covert Operations in the Reagan Era, with
I think
with his son Peter Marshall and Jane Hunter, who's a great.
I think I have that book.
Israel.
Yeah, I'm a bookaholic. Okay, I just want to make sure I have it. Go ahead.
So yeah, I got into it through Iran Contra, and the Reagan era was sort of the golden era of the World Anti-Communist League, and the World Anti-Communist League was involved in supplying arms to the Contras, and its head was at that time former General
Singleb.
Yes, John Singleb.
Yes, isn't that crazy?
Yes, who had been in Korea, so he was close to APACL, and then he joined. And then he became close to these Ukrainians, and you know, it was all going on at once. And I call the Cold War World War III, which is what like they call it.
Yes, I completely agree with you. That's fascinating. So, can you tell me a little bit about Stetsko?
Stetsko was Stephen Bandera's like number 2 man, and he when the Nazis invaded in Western Ukraine, the city of Lvov, which is today called they call themselves Banderastat, like the Bandera city. He declared an independent Ukrainian state, even though like the Nazis only control like Western Ukraine at that part. They didn't take Kiev till later in the year. So, anyways, he declared an independent state, and then the OUN went on this horrific massacre with like Nazis like help or whatever, and, like in cooperation with the German Nazis, and they conducted the Lvov programs where like they killed like tens of thousands of Jews, and it was all photographed. And they also killed a bunch all over Western Ukraine at the same time, and like all these different towns and villages. And he was the prime minister of Ukraine because the Nazis didn't trust Stefan Bandera to go to Ukraine because he was too, independent minded, basically. And so he ended up getting sent to this. They say that they're sent to a concentration camp. This was not like the concentration camp you see in the movies. This was like for the special privileged people. So like in the 80s, they had this term, country club prisons.
Yeah, it was
like
the Hilton. Yeah, it was the Hilton. It was the Hilton version of concentration camps.
Yes, where with other important people like the Romanian Iron Guard and Stalin's son and like Bismarck's grandson and stuff like that. So he spent the war there, and then as the Nazis were losing the war in 1944, he let both Stetsko and Bandera out. Basically, after Bandera died, Stetsko took over. And even before Stetsko and Bandera died, Stetsko was responsible for creating the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, along with British intelligence. And so he was sort of like the mainstay of this whole movement. And his wife was also Slava Stetsko. She was sort of like the Margaret Thatcher of like the Iron, they call her the Iron Lady. And something that I apparently found out was that at the war's end, Stetsko was actually fired upon by an American aircraft and was castrated, and that his wife like cheated on him. That's just sort of gossipy. But anyway, Stetsko headed the ABN. After Bandera died, he became the head of the OUNB, and he was, by the time of the Reagan era, they were actually working with the U.S. government to glorify the OUN and the UPA in Soviet Ukraine using the Radio Liberty, which is part of like RFERL, Radio Freedom, Radio Liberty, the CIA radio station that's still like on the internet today, still on the major news source. And so anyways, right when he died in 1986, but right when the Soviet Union collapsed, his wife, Slava Stetsko, immediately moved to Ukraine. She founded this organization called KUN, to the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists, to promote Bandera's legacy. She worked with and immediately right when the Soviet Union collapsed, or even beforehand, all like the people that had secretly loved Bandera during the Soviet times, but just kept on the low key so they wouldn't get arrested or sent to prison. They all were coming out of the woodwork, and they formed their own fascist groups. So basically, all this stuff goes back to the early 90s, which is what my next. My last article sort of dealt with the origins of it. My next article will also take it up to 2004, the Orange Revolution. And basically, all these people for 20 years promoted this fascist movements in Ukraine. And by 2014, they had armies of 10,000 people. They have been fighting in proxy wars against Russia in Georgia, in this part of Moldova called Transnistria, which is this Russian breakaway region.
Yes.
They were they teamed up with the Chechen terrorists and were
yes,
the bodyguards to Shamil Basayev. And sort of they were, in their minds, the war with Russia began in 1991. And actually others, these tensions where Yeltsin threatened to take back Crimea if the Ukrainians were stop being jerks to him. And there's threats to break away Donetsk and Luhansk even back then, and during the Orange Revolution. So all these fault lines were existing in Ukraine, and then they just sort of exploded in 2014 when they overthrew the government.
So tell me what you found about, because we had that recent incident of the Nazi in Canada. Tell me what you know about their dispersion into Canada, and then I'd like to move on to Australia, what you found there.
In Canada, because it's a smaller country, the Ukrainians are even more influential, way more influential there than they are in the US. So Canada's where they're the strongest. In fact, the foreign minister, or the deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, is descended from a Nazi war criminal. And I think it's like Michael Choviak. I don't have my notes with me. Anyways, so it was no accident that they invited this guy. They have all these same organizations of Waffen SS veterans. They build huge statues and monuments to the Waffen SS Galicia Division. And the other name, like the last month of the war, they declared, this is now called the Ukrainian National Army. So the Canadian province, like, we want to welcome this man who's been fighting against Russia for like 75 years for Ukrainian freedom. He was served in the Ukrainian National Army. Like every single historian that's familiar with this period of Ukraine immediately knows we're talking about the Waffen SS Galicia Division. And there's this Ukrainian scholar, Ivan Kachanovsky, who also exposed that the fact that the Maidan was a massacre was like a false flag carried out by these fascist paramilitaries that were shooting the police and the protesters to discredit the Yanukovych government.
Yeah, that's actually.
So anyways, he's the one who exposed it, and then for some reason, the Jewish press grabbed onto it, and then it actually went mainstream, and there was actually a scandal. But they do this all the time, and there's usually no scandal.
Yeah, there was actually a court case in Ukraine that proved that Right Sector had rented the entire hotel that was firing into the crowds and killing all of those people. Yeah.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about there, from the hotel that they
Yeah.
control.
Yeah.
And on this Canada thing, you've got these Waffen SS Galicia divisions they're part of all these Ukrainian movements, and I think the actual like head of it was like the editor of like the Ukraine Encyclopedia of Ukraine. It's like all these former Nazis became historians on Ukraine and like shaped the whole idea of how people think about Ukraine as this. Like I said earlier, there was no country in Ukraine, so there were a time where they like to say they're a decolonial movement. It's not like they were. There was never a time where Russia conquered these people that consider themselves to be Ukrainians and then trying to force them to speak Russian or something. They just sort of grew their identity that grew out of these Russians, basically. So it's all like a lie, but it's a lie that they still are selling today.
Well, yeah, they were taught well by the CIA. You control the language and the history, and you control the future.
Like you read this guy Serhiy Plohi, who's like a Ukrainian liberal from Eastern Ukraine, but he gives kind of like the non-fascist, but complete nonsense version that was sort of developed in the 19th century.
So what did you find in Australia?
In Australia, the head of the OUNB was this guy Stefan Romanu, who was like the head of the worldwide OUNB. He was Stefan Romanu. He went to the way that they work. You see, this would have died out, but they have youth camps and like cultural centers so that they can indoctrinate the whole new generation. So this is like the third generation of these Ukrainians. Like now it's no longer people that were Nazi collaborators because those people died of old age and stuff, but it's like their children and grandchildren. And basically he died last year and he was treated as a national hero in Australia, where they're like, this is like, they're celebrating the head of the OUNB is this, great Democrat and figure for Ukrainians living in Australia.
That is amazing, isn't it?
Oh yeah. Well, now that you've been studying for 10 years, basically, it's like that. Yet again, it's amazing what you can. I mean, that was another major thing, like in Syria, how you can openly be supporting Al Qaeda when just the whole war on terror started as supposedly fighting Al Qaeda, and all of a sudden, 10 years later, we're openly supporting Al Qaeda in Libya and Syria, and it's just like nobody's like, why are we supporting Al Qaeda in Libya and Syria in the mainstream media? They just call them modern rebels, freedom fighters, and you're not allowed to talk about it.
Right. They just changed the names. They're now rebels.
Yes.
Yeah, but they're all created by the same apparatus with the intel agencies. Just like we all know now that Al Qaeda was created by along with the Mujahideen, the Muslim Brotherhood. They're chaos agents, not unlike everything that we've been talking about here. They generate chaos agents in order to do their dirty work.
Yeah, there was that through like the World Anti-Communist League. there is a bunch of connections between the Ukrainian fascists and these Islamist fascists, basically, because they were both based in Munich. There's this book called A Mosque in Munich. I haven't actually read, but I've heard about it from Dave Emery. He's this researcher who's famous for studying fascism and the CIA kind of thing, topics. And so that's why they fought in Chechnya. That like this thing between the Ukrainians and the Turks, and like Ukrainians were helping the rebels that are taking over Syria right now. They've supplied them with drones and stuff like that, and we're sending advisors there and having secret talks with the HTS, which used to be Al Nusra, the Al Qaeda in Syria.
And see, I think that's the connection that Gladio has to all of this, is because if you go to Turkey and you find the Grey Wolves there, you also realize that they're a product of this entire
absolutely.
structures. Yeah.
FBI whistleblower civil admin famously called
Correct.
Al Qaeda Gladio B. And,
yes.
Exposed the role of Turkish intelligence in fighting it all over Central Asia during the 90s.
Well,
after 9/11.
Yeah, and we found that Tajikistan provided a lot of the quote unquote Muslims for Chechnya as well as Bosnia, and all went to the same terror training camps, a lot of which were in Turkey.
Oh yeah. So yeah, well, obviously the Turkish role at this point is just like, they were having truck convoys of ISIS bringing oil to Turkey during like the Syria war and stuff like that. Like, yes, Turkey's kind of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all fund Al Qaeda. They're sort of like the cutouts to like the ordinary people who would want to fight on behalf of America and Israel. So it's like they answer to these Muslim countries. They think they're fighting for Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey, but really they're fighting for the U.S. and the CIA, Mossad.
That is crazy. So what I find it interesting, the amount of research that you have done on this. And you said that you originally caught on to the whole Ukrainian smoke and mirrors by researching Iran-Contra.
Well, that's part of it. Also, a major one is Yugoslavia.
So tell us about Yugoslavia.
Basically, during the 90s, there's Yugoslavia, which during the Cold War, it was a socialist country, but it broke from the Soviet Union and it made a secret deal with NATO. It was sort of served its useful purpose as a sort of neutral country between the Soviets and the West, because during World War II, MI6 had worked with the Yugoslav partisans like Tito, so they had this relationship, and so Stalin never trusted him, even though he was probably loyal. Anyways, they had this split. And then after the Cold War, the U.S. decided to break up Yugoslavia into these teeny countries based on the different ethnicities. And you had Croatia, which is very similar to the Ukrainians, where they were this fascist group, worse than the Nazis, basically, the Ustashi. And they were like best friends with the OUNB prior to World War II and stuff even. And especially afterwards. And in Bosnia, you had like this Muslim Brotherhood inspired type government, and then you had the Serbs, which had close ties to like Russia. So basically, it was this proxy war between the U.S. and Russia, but like Russia was sort of like a puppet of the U.S. at the time, so it didn't help. It didn't really help Yugoslavia much, and in the end, it was broken up, and then Serbia was broken up, and into what's that? Montenegro was split off from Serbia even. So they created these teeny little countries that will just have no choice but to do whatever the EU and NATO says, because they're just like insignificant and they can't really do anything on their own to resist corporations or the EU, and they're just being sort of like nice little puppets, and they want to break up everything. That's like Israel's plan for the Middle East, is to like break up all these countries into these teeny little sectarian states so that they'll never be a threat to Israel. And of course, that was a lot like Syria, Libya, and all these strategies for the past 30 years have been about is like breaking up, weakening, destroying all these countries in the Middle East so that they'll never be a threat to Israel.
Yeah, we actually found a document that talks about this strategy.
And that's something that thinking goes back to the 19th century in the Zionist movement.
Correct. Because you have not only the Yugoslavia, but they've been doing it in Lebanon. And many people say that that's exactly what happened, and why we went immediately into Korea is, in addition to trying to reinstall Chiang Kai-shek back into China. But when we couldn't achieve that, then breaking them up so that there's no unity there, and the same thing in Vietnam. And you just see this perpetually going around the world in many of the different places in redefining to basically break any future resistance.
Yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. What else? And I find it interesting, just so that everybody can see the correlation here. The whole Bosnia Yugoslavia quote unquote war was waged during the time that Wesley Clark was the NATO general. And for those of you who've been following our information, Wesley Clark, as NATO commander, would have been in charge of all of the Operation Gladio assets throughout Europe during his tenure as NATO commander. And of course, it's not surprising that in the disaster in Waco, he was also the local military commander at Fort Hood that provided all the resources for them to do the raid on the Waco compound. So just to try to tie those.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that about Waco, but Wesley Clark almost started World War III with the Russians in the 90s when I think it was 1999, the Russians got fed up with like what NATO was doing, and they sent their troops to this airport. And Wesley Clark's like, no. And so he sent the NATO forces to go confront them, and it was like really led to this shooting war between Russia and NATO during the Yeltsin years. That was sort of like 1999 was the final straw when the U.S. bombs. They basically gave Serbia, like, you have to allow us to do whatever we want in your country, and just basically like we're allowed to military occupy your country, and that was their peace terms because they would reject it, and then they bombed it basically. When Russia saw NATO destroyed, start bombing Serbia after like Russia had been like, calm down, Serbia, don't rock the boat, like the West could be our friends. That's why they were like, no, this is like a threat to us, like we're next on NATO's list, and
yes,
that's why they brought Putin to power basically because of the Clintons and like Wesley Clark's antics.
Correct. Definitely not a good guy. I also want to bring everyone's attention to, we did a book review on Otto Skorzeny and his role in training the original cast of characters in Ukraine for like back in the Stetsko Bandera, because him and Reinhard Gehlen were both put up at the Hilton concentration camps too. And then transitioned into important NATO roles after World War II. So this kind of all fits the same model.
Yes, like Skorzeny was sort of the head of the underground Nazi SS movement that like was after the war, where they're sort of like, they continue to operate, and then Gehlen headed like the official American one. So there's sort of Skorzeny is sort of like the off the books Fourth Reich, and Gehlen's like the American approved version of it.
Right.
They're working closely together. And of course, all over the world. And of course, we talked about moving these Nazi war criminals to America, Canada, and Australia. But of course, they moved them also to Latin America and to the Middle East. And Skorzeny actually was working with like all the different Arab nationalist movements and trained their forces. But then he also made a secret deal with the Israelis, so he's like betraying the Egyptians at the same time.
Correct.
Like Egyptian scientists.
Yeah, he was quite busy and I don't know if you found this in your research, but we found the documents that tied him. He was being paid through the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force, in base contracts, him and his partner in Spain, in Madrid, to build U.S. military bases in Spain, So that's how NATO was paying Otto Skorzeny to be their basic like Gladio trainer. He planned missions for them. He trained assassins for them. And it was done through U.S. Air Force contracts to build military facilities in Spain.
Oh yeah, I haven't heard that detail, but yeah, he had this Paladin mercenary group, which was like when all over the world was sort of the Nazi Blackwater, and also Scorsese was married to, I think it was a crop, like this big German, like the daughter of one of these huge German weapons manufacturers. He was a salesman for them too.
Yes. So, yeah, he has quite the story, and we found him in the coup in the Congo and several other U.S. Gladio style overthrows of government in Algeria. He was part of that operation on behalf of France. So they kept him quite busy.
Absolutely. He's like, that's one of the things I like to write about is people that like go all over the world and like, are involved in so many different covert operations and missions where so like you learn all these things that most people don't even know ever happened. Like people like Ted Shackley at the CIA or Stefano Della Pie, this Italian guy that like first he went to Spain, like hung out with Scorsese type people. He went to Greece, then he went to like Latin America and worked with all like the fascist governments in like Argentina and Chile and the Bolivian cocaine coup. And
yeah, he was one of the few that shows up on almost all of the coups.
Yeah, Gladio, Eddie is of course Wacko member, and I like people like the worse they are, the more interesting I find them.
True. It definitely, when you start researching it from that perspective, which is kind of what we did as well, you find out that all of the history that we were taught is basically completely backwards of reality.
Yeah, well, people aren't supposed to know anything about history. They're just supposed to, turn on the news and nothing has any context. It's just sort of happening, and it's just the way the world is. And you're not really supposed to be like, how did this happen? Like, how did this get this way? You're not supposed to like go back and study like the history of all the Israeli wars so you can understand the history of the Middle East and stuff. You're just supposed to be ignorant and constantly be like, what's the next thing? Like, what clothes should I buy? What TV show is coming out? Like, what's the shiny new thing that will distract me from reality?
So, what is kind of, if you had one thing that was the most profound thing that you've discovered that kind of, what is the one thing that you would want everyone to take away from the research that you've done?
It's hard to say, but I would say maybe just the fact that these former fascists, the role in the Cold War is just like so ever present in every element of it. And the fact that this is just like completely unknown until like the 80s or 90s. I mean, some people know about it, but like just the fact that just the fact that you could get away with supporting anybody and just tell them, like, on the news, they'll just call them freedom fighters and people won't believe it, no matter whether they're Nazis, whether they're Al Qaeda, what have you.
As long as you referred to them as communists, you could get away with anything.
Well, the silence critics basically do it. Like, if you were saying, like, you brought up the fact that Allen Dulles and his brother had been, like, funding the Nazis before the war, they're just like, that is what they're saying in Moscow. You are repeating communist propaganda, which means either you are a communist sympathizer or you're a communist, which means you hate America, so no one should listen to you and we should send the FBI to investigate you, basically. They used, like I said, every aspect of it. Like McCarthy was working with these Nazis and they were providing him all this intelligence from this sort of Nazi independent private intelligence contracting firm called The Pond, and they were the ones supplying all this money, all the information, and then Chiang Kai-shek's people were the ones like funding the whole Red Scare. So it's like, even like McCarthy in himself is just sort of a part of this Nazi fascist involvement with like mainstream American politics,
but do you
national security state.
right? But that in and of itself became the psyop, right? If you didn't have all of that stuff happening and you didn't paint the whole communist and attack anybody that tried to say something, oh, but you've got the fascist over here, and it's like, shut up, you're commie lover. That
basically, like when World War II ended, the opinion polls like America just wanted peace and they just wanted to go back to normal. But of course, these people wanted to start a Cold War, and it only took them 2 years to completely shift that around and get everybody panicked that the Soviet Union was going to take over the world, which they couldn't do because they were so damaged from World War II that they just were concentrating on rebuilding, not trying to start another war.
right.
which they knew, but of course they needed to get the arms budgets up and stuff. So
right,
and to keep military Keynesianism going, they need to, World War II got us out of the Depression, and we're like, we can't just go back to how it was before that. We need to have a permanent standing army, and to justify that, we need to have communism as the enemy. But then once the Cold War ends, you realize it's just all about power and money, because Russia's not communist, but we're still acting like they are communist because it's convenient.
Well, but the psyops changed to radical Islam, right? So you always have to have a boogeyman. They're always going to have a boogeyman.
And that's way more of a joke because they really did hate communists, but they do not hate radical Islam. Obviously, our closest allies are radical Islamists like Saudi Arabia and Qatar.
But Hugo, I'm going to push back a little bit on that. For exactly the reason you already identified. The same people that were funding the fascist in Germany funded the communist in Russia. Trotsky.
I disagree with that.
Well, Trotsky and Lenin both were funded by New York City and London.
I think I'm a communist, but I think that's sort of overplayed. I mean, there were people that are powerful enough that they could get away with doing business in Russia and not get like in trouble for like doing business with a communist country, like an enemy country.
But at this point, it's not
that much of influence,
right? But at this point,
has huge resources. Even back then, you had.
But that was their whole purpose in doing it, is they wanted the resources in these countries. So overthrowing the czar provided them entree, regardless of what government gets installed, into the country. You had General Electric move right in and electrify all of Bolshevik, communist Soviet Union. You had the railroad magnates immediately jump on board and start putting railroads throughout all of now what we're going to call the Soviet Union. And so they sent Red Cross missions over there that had nothing to do with Red Cross, because they were all businessmen under the guise of spying on what opportunities they were. And they even set up New York and London bankers in the banks that they set up in Soviet Union.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree. But
well,
I'm not saying that everything you're saying is not true. I'm just saying that I interpret like the reasons for it separately. Yes, I mean there were American corporations that operated in like Stalin's like Soviet Union.
Yes,
and that they helped them like build up the force that eventually beat the Nazis as well. And so in that sense, you're right. But I think that like ultimately the Soviet Union actually was a more of a threat to big business because they did not have Soviet corporations. It was all state-owned.
Well, they were a threat.
Stalin really, like,
yeah, they were a threat after they
after the Russian Civil War. There was a period where they had to reintroduce capitalism called the New Economic Period.
So
that sort of explains that part of it. And then when Stalin needed to industrialize, that was the same time that FDR decided to recognize the Soviet Union, and they needed help industrializing. So these American corporations went in there, and like American workers went into the Soviet Union to help them build up. But in general, I would say that they really did want to stop communism because that would be taking away like the money. Like ultimately, America is behind the government. You've got the big corporations, and they do not want all their stuff to be seized by governments.
Which is technically fascism. Right. So they definitely gravitate towards fascist, totalitarian kind of Mussolini models. But at the same time, and see, this is, Hugo, what I've kind of come to appreciate. If they don't create the boogeyman and somewhat contain and control the boogeyman, they can't use the boogeyman to do their dastardly deeds. And I have come to appreciate this model more after doing all this research. And I'll just give you one other example. Cuba. Cuba was, Castro and his brother were trained by the CIA along with Che Guevara to overthrow Batista's government after they installed Batista because he was getting out of control. So the CIA likes both to control both sides, right? So they'll fund both sides of a revolution so that they can control the outcome. And you have to believe that the CIA, who could go into any country and assassinate any president across the world, tried 400 times and could never assassinate Castro. That part may or may not be true. I'm not even going to argue that point. But he's 90 miles from our coast and they never could put a glove on him. So let's just say that somehow that actually happened. The thing that I found most fascinating about every coup in Latin America, and I mean every one of them, and there's over 40, is the premise in print every single time to justify US aiding the quote unquote rebels like the Contras was that we couldn't afford to have another Castro. We couldn't afford to have another communist government in our hemisphere. And so the use of these, in the case of Castro, CIA created and trained boogeymen reappear periodically. The same thing with Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan and the dictator that they installed in South Korea. They are used perpetually as a thing that we have to avoid having this, while at the same time we helped create it.
I don't consider, like, say, Fidel Castro to be sort of a CIA puppet, but there was true that there was a part of the CIA that was supporting Castro prior to him winning.
And I didn't say it was a CIA puppet. I'm just saying.
People in the CIA that were called, like, Fidel, they call themselves Fidelistas, basically.
Yes.
But Castro, we have to remember that Castro wasn't actually a communist he didn't declare himself a communist until after relations broke down. So
correct.
They knew that Batista had to go, and they thought maybe they could control that Castro could be like a Nasser type figure.
Correct. I'm just saying
nationalist.
They use it to their advantage, though.
I would definitely say that, yes. I mean, ultimately, you're right, because Castro did not have to be the enemy of the U.S. They chose to.
Correct.
The boogeyman. He
correct.
Friendly relations instead, but because things escalated, and then they tried to overthrow him.
And the one president that reached out to try to normalize relationships with him was JFK.
Of course, and we know what happened.
Well, then that would shut down the boogeyman. We can't have him get rid of the boogeyman. Stop it. So sorry about that. My dogs are getting a little crazy. But yeah, I just find that very interesting. And of course, for me, as with any researcher, there are things, like we refer to them as patterns, that after you come across the seventh coup.
Let me just say this real quick.
Sure.
You can. I'm going to be myself for a couple of minutes. Go ahead, and I'll just tell you when I'm muted or whatever.
Okay. Yeah. After you come across the seventh coup that has used the exact same mantra as the reason why they're doing what they're doing, you start to go back in time and reevaluate all of the things that you used as the foundation to go, well, wait a minute. And especially when you get to the aspect of something like a Cuba, where, again, the CIA assassinated hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals that, in remarkable ways, very original ways of doing it to include a heart attack gun, that we are supposed to believe that they could never touch Castro. And at this point, I'm on the bandwagon of I don't believe that. But anyway, that's me. So, Cousin It, Bridget, what do you guys want to make any observations of what we've talked about today before we open the mics up?
Yes, Hugo, thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate it. For those of you that are new here, Hugo has done extensive research on the Nazis out of the Ukrainian and Russian area. That being said, one of the ways that I found him was his information on Alexander Dugin. I don't know if everybody recalls a couple of years ago, Daria Dugina was killed in a car bomb, and there was a lot of propaganda going around how Alexander Dugin is like the sage of the Kremlin, and that's not exactly true. And Hugo, if you don't mind, your research on Alexander Dugin I found fascinating. If you wouldn't mind touching on that briefly, and how he was involved with Italy and Spain, I think that would also give a heads up as to who this guy actually is and how it ties into Navalny.
Okay, I think he had to take a break for a couple of seconds, Cousin It, so he's going to be right back with us. I wrote that down as a note, and we'll have him address that when he does come back. He said,
"Well, shoot, I just put down the gun. I was up 4 squirrels."
No, he was saying, "Oh, I have an update for you on squirrel hunting too. You just need to get you an escapoo." My husband said she brought 2 to the door today, so I don't even have to waste bullets.
What a good girl.
And she's this tiny little dog. It's hilarious. But yeah, 2 of them.
Wow, that's not sporting at all.
I think it's awesome. But anyway, that's me. Bridget, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it just goes back into this giant web. And the more, for a long time I kept on getting distracted by the web, and I couldn't see the threads that weave within it. But really just a handful of, we'll say, pivotal key people that keep popping up. Those are the main threads in this web that had someone address this.
Oh, I think she dropped off. You still there, Bridget?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. But it seems like there's a few very specific individuals that were plucking the strings of all of this. Just like we were seeing with the Nazis and how they got redistributed. It could have been taken care of. This could have been stopped.
Well, yeah, of course it could have. I mean, they could have actually had a Nuremberg trial.
Right. And this was such an intentional deception that's still going on today. And it until they start rectifying or admitting that this stuff happened, I don't see how it can ever be rectified.
Okay, Hugo's.
Hey, I'm back.
Okay, Hugo. Cousin It has a couple of things that she wanted you to talk about.
I heard her question.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, Dugin. He's a fascinating figure. I covered Dugin in my underground bike station. This is sort of earlier series I did, inspired by radio talk show / researcher Dave Emery, where you can find this thousands of hours of shows that he's done. He's been doing this stuff since the 80s. When I was like 7, basically. Well, I only found out about him actually like a year after I started my blog. Anyways, he interviewed 2 authors, Kevin Coogan and Martin Lee, who were focused on the strange mutating nature of some of these post-war fascist movements. And in Italy, you had the third way type of fascism, and it was sort of, trying to merge fascism with communism, basically, and sort of, you had Nazi Maoism and stuff like that. So, anyways, Dugin in Russia was inspired by this, so he created the fourth way, or the fourth positional theory, and he's sort of a chameleon figure because each of the four positions his followers can pretend to be. They can pretend to be liberals, they can pretend to be communists, they can pretend to be like Nazis, or they can, just be like Duginists. And it's sort of like he has elements of all of these. So you'll have, Duginists talking to like left-wing people, and communist left-wing people, and at the same time they'll like do another interview where they're talking like a far right person. So know your audience, manipulate it, and in the press they call him Putin's brain. He's not really that important in Russia, but he's like way more important than he should be. Like he co-wrote part like the Communist Party of Russia's platform, and he's like they signed his book on geopolitics in the military school. I think that's why basically his followers are useful, because one of his obsessions is geopolitics, and geopolitics is something that, if you want to understand the world, you just sort of like view it as a chessboard, and that's how that's how the American Empire thinks, and that's how like Russia and China, that's how everybody thinks basically. Russia is important because it occupies this position at the top of dominates Eurasia basically, and so in that sense, it's like natural position is to dominate the Eurasian heartland. And to counter that, you have like the British version, which is like focus on the sea. So to dominate Eurasia, they built this huge navy and built like all these bases all over the coast of China and all over the world basically. So Dugan's obsessions are he portrays himself these days just sort of as I'm just a conservative Orthodox guy, but he used to also be like openly a Satanist and a cultist. So he's not. His defenders will be like, he's just a conservative. It's traditionalism. Well, traditionalism is actually this sort of it's a form of fascism from Italy, basically.
Yep.
Where it had this sort of double thing where publicly, it's sort of like the Nazis themselves. It's like publicly, it's like, oh, we'll just get Christians, and then privately they're like, all obsessed with like, let's create a worship of the sun cult and a warrior caste and stuff like that, and a secret brotherhood that will dominate the world. That's like Julius Evola, one of the major influences on Dugin. So basically, he takes on all these influences from all around the world and like merges it into this very sort of paradoxical form of fascism that many say pro-Russian alt-media figures are actually these secret Duginists. And the thing about Dugin that just pisses me off is that he, like, if he was just pro-Russian, that would side pro-Russian. I would have said this, but like Dugin was his followers were in Ukraine, and they were working with these Ukrainian fascists, and like these Ukrainian fascists, some of them are former Duginists, like even Zelensky's former presidential advisor, Estovich, he is a former Duginist. And they were also working in like Turkey, and they were working with these like Al-Qaeda groups. So basically, they were working with all the people that are like fighting like the multipolar world order, fighting Russia. So it's like, it's very treacherous in my view. And yes, the Ukrainian, the stay behind network in Russia assassinated Dugin's daughter like early in the war, Daria Dugin, who was, she was like a fascist also, and she was very good at handling Western fans of Dugin, so made mourned her loss. And it's kind of, obviously it's messed up to murder someone's daughter, but I cry more for just sort of innocent civilians.
And they definitely target family members as part of their actual terror campaign.
The Ukrainians that, well, it's not clear whether they intend to kill Dugin and accidentally kill his daughter, but maybe they did just intend to kill his daughter or whatever.
I'm just saying they have done that. That is a tactic.
Yes. Oh
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. The dirty war. That's what it's all about. Is still like the person runs away to fight in the woods as a guerrilla, and you just massacre their family while they're gone.
Yes. Yes. They did that a lot. They do that a lot.
Yes, Israel does it, and America does it, everybody does it. And that's like also, you know, in torture, they would kidnap the people's families. So like they want to like torture the family to make the other person talk, or like play recordings of it, or, you know, hold hostages. But this stuff goes back to the ancient world.
Well, and that's one of the things that the Ustasi and those were doing, that if they wanted somebody to talk, they kidnapped their family and then tortured the family in front of the person they wanted them to talk. Yeah.
Yes, but like people like the Ustasi and the Ukrainians, it's like they just took such delight and such humor and such, it was like a carnival of sadism when they did this stuff. And it's sort of like, that's the messed up thing, is just like these ordinary presidents just sort of, you know, it's like high school bullying, but like by serial killers kind of thing.
Yes.
Just like to them, it's fun to torture this person and make them beg for mercy. And really that attitude persists very much to this day, where, you know, like if you say something that's like, I want peace in Ukraine or something, they'll say like, we're gonna like put you on a bottle, which literally means like they're gonna sodomize you with like a bottle and have you kidnapped by the secret police, the SBU, and that's what's going to happen to you. And to them, that's funny.
And that's what they were doing. And one of the things that we did not touch on was, that I bring up often, is that New York Times article that was published now like 6 months ago that acknowledged the CIA setting up those underground facilities in the immediate aftermath of the 2014 coup. And they were using them to launch the operations into the Donbass region, where they assassinated 11 mayors, and they were bombing cities. They were kidnapping people. They were assassinating people. And those are basically modeled on the Stay Behind units, where they were launching those operations. And a lot of them happened from the Kolomoisky, quote unquote, governed area.
Oh, absolutely. They were, I mean, they're, even though like there's people in every area of Ukraine that support, like Russian occupied Ukraine, that there is a Gladio behind Russian lies, and there was a Gladio just in the separatist republics that assassinated all the people that were like considered heroes by people that like supported the Russian separatists. They were all assassinated.
Yes.
Within a year. Some of them were like assassinated by like corrupt people on their own side, but like a lot of them were killed by like the Ukrainian intelligence. But to them, I mean, they're just everybody that lived in that area, whether they're like a grandma or a 4-year-old child, was a terrorist.
But
they call it the anti-terrorist operation. They were quite openly saying, you know, it's going to be great that your children will have to live in basements for the next 10 years and will never go to school because we're just going to keep shelling you nonstop and cutting off your power and not paying you anything. So they kind of were the whole people, of course, like assassinating with the ringleaders. They felt no remorse at all about, of course.
And it's important to understand that when you use the term Ukrainian intelligence, there really wasn't a separate Ukrainian intelligence function. It pretty much was locked hip to hip with the CIA, much like the Pakistani quote unquote ISI was never independent. It was always a cohort of the CIA.
Oh yeah, and then you also remind me, like when I said earlier that like, well, the Ukrainian intelligence guy said we need to adopt the tactics of the OUN UPA. That's the same guy that the New York Times interviewed for this thing.
Yes,
that article is such a joke because like right after Maidan, the CIA decided, hey, you know, let's go see what's going on in Ukraine after the coup. It's like, of course they were involved long before the coup, and it's like, oh, why'd they call this guy? Oh, because he was already working with them like for the past 20 years. It's like they try to sell people on this idea. They're like, oh, we definitely weren't involved in a Maidan coup or anything, you know, or the Revolution of Dignity, as they call it, or the Maidan Revolution or the Revolution of Dignity. Not a coup, of course.
Right. Well, and Hugo, I know you're new to our things, but for me, being my military background, I'm very strict on language when we talk about stuff because just because I know the tactics of psyops and the use and co-opting of words, I firmly believe that of course, it was a coup, but the use of the CIA creating this brand new term called color revolution, it allows for a separation that if you go back and you do a word search on color revolution, you only start seeing them in the 2000s. If you do a word search on CIA coups, you find them all the way back to 1948.
Oh, yes, of course. The original name for color revolution was a people powered coup. And so, like, the first one was actually in the Philippines when they overthrew Marcos, who was an ally.
Of course.
Well, yeah, of course, color. I mean, I think actually the critics of these movements created the name color revolution because they think it was just, they called them revolutions and they just each happened to have this like branding color because they have no goals other than, like the ordinary people seem to have like no goals or purpose. It's just sort of like what the NGOs say is democracy or something. And then, of course, you have the undercurrent of the hardcore nationalists or Islamist groups that like also get.
Well, they also.
So you have either the extremists or you have these liberal NGO people, and they're allied very closely. In Ukraine, you see this where like the liberal, it's like they're not like our liberals because they're like, you know, I kind of really like Stephen Bandera. Like I know he's problematic, but you know, he's sort of like my problematic fave. That's like the liberal attitude in Ukraine, like
right,
like the Nazis.
Right. Well, it goes back to they like anything that is opposite of what we're told to hate, which was the communist.
Yeah. Well, and it's just sort of like they have the same kind of the sort of liberalism that they have in Eastern Europe is very much this sort of, you know, the West is superior. And they think that just because Ukraine's to the west of Russia,
right?
It's in Western Europe. I mean, there's still like all these Eastern European countries to the west of Ukraine. You know, like Poland is, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, all these Eastern European countries. They're not Western Europeans. It's like we're to the west of Russia. So like this goes back to Dontsov, where it's like we will like import everything from the West instead of Russia, basically. That's a Ukrainian nationalist thing. And that's actually why Stalin, originally the Bolsheviks supported Ukrainian, like the Ukrainian language and stuff. Like Russian nationalists hate the fact that the Soviet Union is like promoted Ukrainian culture and like, you know, help create this fake country, basically, as they see it. And so, but the reason why Stalin's like cracked down on them in 1929, which they never mentioned why, is because these Soviet Ukrainians were saying like, we need to like model everything on the West, and you know they're all like, you know, there's these great guys in the Ukrainian guys in like Western Ukraine. They're doing this great avant-garde poetry, like Dmitry Dontsov and his disciples. So like they're fans of fashion, and they're fans of, you know, we need to do everything the way the West wants to do, which is obviously not good what you want when you're like fighting a Cold War with the West in your country. So that's why they cracked down on the Ukrainizers in 1929.
Yeah, they always leave that part out. So yeah. You mentioned modern day other areas like Moldova that are basically experiencing some very similar aspects of what went on in Ukraine. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I know like a lot less about Moldova, but so Moldova is it's sort of like Ukraine in the sense that it's kind of a fake country, just a part that they carved off of Romania. And
I love it.
Moldova, and they speak Romanian.
You're talking my language. All of these fake countries, I talk about them all the time. I love the fact that you do too. Go ahead.
So anyways, when there was basically this civil war in the early 90s in eastern Moldova, it's very confusing. It was in Transnistria, so basically the Soviet army was left over there. And they were like the Moldova, this kind of nationalist movement. So like all these sort of Russian separatists ended up carving this part of Moldova called Transnistria off. And they sort of like, they kept the Soviet Union. It's like a mini Soviet Union, but not really. But so for the past 30 years, there's been Moldova, half of Moldova is occupied by this Russian separatist thing. And actually all the electricity in Moldova comes from this part that's controlled by like these pro-Russian separatists, basically. And so there's this constant danger that Ukraine is going to invade Transnistria and like crush these people because like Russia can't really supply them because they're cut off from it by Ukraine. And every year or so, there's like this panic among the pro-Russian crowd that Ukraine's about to invade Transnistria. And NATO's always encouraging Moldova to, like start the civil war again to reclaim Transnistria, but because they generate the power and stuff, it's like very inconvenient. So it hasn't happened yet. And the Russian dream is, of course, to retake Odessa and then create a land bridge to Transnistria, so that they'll have this like strip that goes from Russia to Transnistria, and they'll control the whole Black Sea coast and stuff.
And I do think that's kind of the key to this whole thing, for everything that you just said. Odessa seems to be like one of the pivot points, not only for the water access, but also to ethnic Russian populations that they feel a need to protect against the West. And here's a news flash. They wouldn't feel a need to protect them if the West would quit trying to attack them.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a very fascinating city. And actually, I think Jewish organized crime had this huge Jewish organized crime movement that they moved to America and stuff. So probably like the origins of American organized crime, Odessa played like an important role. And in Russia, there's like this kind of gangster culture that comes out of Odessa. Like they have these folk music that celebrates sort of like the criminal underground. Sort of like in Mexico, they have like the music about formerly about outlaws, now about narcos, or America, we have like gangster rap and stuff like that. This is like the 19th century I'm talking about, in the early 20th century. So anyways, yeah, Odessa has this large Russian and Jewish population and Greek population. And right after the Maidan coup, they were like very pro-Russian, and they're like, they held this huge, they're holding these huge marches and stuff. And so they sent these fascist paramilitaries there. They got into the street battle, and they like, the people that like were the fighters like disappeared, and then the fascist paramilitaries chased like the like nonviolent people like into this building, and then like lit it on fire. And then the Ukrainians were like joking. The Ukrainian politicians were joking. It's like, this is a wonderful barbecue. They killed like 150 innocent people in this Odessa trade union building. It's very famous in Russia, called the Odessa massacre. And the survivors had jumped out of the burning building. They beat them to death with metal rods. And so like that was a major cause of the civil war. Like when the Russians saw that, they were like, these people are serious. This isn't just some like, propaganda that the Ukrainians are out to get us. Like this, they are serious. And the Ukrainians were like, we're burning these Colorado beetles, because the St. George's ribbon, I guess, looks like the same colors as like a beetle. And they were just celebrating the death of all these people in this fire, and like, thank God, we stopped this Russian separatist movement. And then they made the Georgian president who had started this war with Russia into the governor of like Odessa, Mikhail Saakashvili. So it's like a bizarre. And for Russia, this is like the major port of Ukraine. It's where all like grain supplies comes in and out of, and so it's a major dream to retake Odessa, both to like avenge this the Odessa massacre, and also for like economic and that's the part of Ukraine they want, all the coastline, because Russia, it's a huge landmass, but it doesn't have that much coastline. They'll war about it, ports and stuff. So that's like their obsession geopolitically.
And just for anyone of you guys that have watched The Ghost of Base Patrick Henry or The Alpha, they did a couple of shows on the Pale of Settlement. That's in that same area where all of the Jewish people were kind of pushed into that area by the Tsar in Russia, and where that was set up, way back when. And so that's all that same conversation. So when he talks about the Jewish mafia and where those people originally came from, that's what he's referring to. So just so y'all can make that connection
Yeah, I'm
there.
definitely not an ethnically theorist, but I am interested in sort of the history of organized crime and
Yeah.
as a researcher, you have to understand like the people focus on the Italians, but it's sort of like Biolasky was the real boss above Luciano.
Absolutely. And one of the things that one of the aspects of this whole conversation that people have asked me repeatedly about when we first started our revelations, if you will, or our deep dive into this historical mess was, how do you transition from what happened prior to World War II to the aftermath of World War II? And for me, conceptually, all of the elements of regime change that had occurred in the late 1800s, early 1900s were basically orchestrated internationally by the same group of oligarchs and corporation, trust, whatever you want to call it, and government entities. But the only country that had a formalized intelligence agency was MI6 out of the UK. And what they found was that so many of the different pieces required to overthrow governments were outside of the government. And in order to be able to protect them from prosecution, they basically took all of the criminal elements, to include the mafia, and incorporated them into all of the brand new intelligence agencies that popped up around the world. So you had this melding of, businessmen, lawyers, like they had combined into the OSS, working with the mafia, and they had basically this open door, but they all were protected by a rubber stamp called national security under the auspices of intel agencies like the CIA post World War II.
Absolutely, that's like my other major obsessions. Is just the fascinating thing is, like, of course, the CIA and drugs and the history that goes back to like before World War II to like Chiang Kai-shek's China. And the truth is that you cannot smuggle drugs unless you have people in the government of the country you're smuggling into that are helping you.
Correct.
And are protecting you. And you have to get a pass, and like you can't just the people that they bust are the people that don't have the clearance to smuggle the drugs.
The competition.
Yes. And basically the whole war on drugs is to like switch sides between who you're targeting, and like when it becomes convenient, you like bust this person, but you let somebody else rise up, and then eventually bust them.
Yeah, we found out that we traced back the quote unquote Nixon war on drugs to basically being the elimination of the French Corsican mafia and moving it all down to Sicily, which the CIA controlled. There was no actual war on drugs. There was a war on the CIA's competition.
Yes. There's a book called The Great Heroin Coup, which is like a classic book, which also talks about wacko too.
Yes. Yeah, I have that book too.
The fact that they use poppy pins for holidays.
Not any holiday, the Veterans Day.
The Veterans Day, specifically to rub our nose in it.
Yes. Yeah, our wars are opium wars, and that was personified, as Bridget just said, by the adoption of a poppy pin on Veterans Day. And I never understood that. I didn't even get the correlation until
a British thing.
Yeah, but I mean,
I didn't know they did in America, but I know it's in Britain.
Oh yes.
After World War I, so that's where.
Oh yes.
Started.
Yeah, they do it here. And it didn't even kind of click in my head until we first started doing this research. And my husband looked at me and he goes, "Isn't that what they give out on Veterans Day?" And I'm like, "Son of a bitch."
Yeah, in the era of Afghanistan, well, I guess back in Vietnam, I don't know when they started doing it, but
well, it goes back to the Boxer.
Like,
yeah, it goes back to the
yeah,
it goes back to the Boxer Wars in China.
Oh
yeah, yeah, they've been doing it for a long time. Chiang Kai-shek, biggest drug king in the world.
It's like if you include coffee and alcohol, like the whole slave trade was like the rum molasses slave trade. So it's like just always the empire and drugs have always been connected. Obviously, alcohol is legal, but it's still a drug. Also,
Well, but even
it's actually a pretty powerful drug.
no, but that's actually a good point, because what happened, the whole prohibition thing was manipulated in order for them to get rich.
Oh, yeah.
So you're absolutely right. I mean, that was, so when they implemented prohibition in the United States, they didn't do it in Canada. And so that's how Seagram's and Crown and all those guys in Canada got rich, by running it down to the Pritzkers and all of the mafia elements in the North, in New York and Detroit and Chicago. All of that became their way of becoming millionaires.
Yep. The Bronfmans.
And the Brofmans, you're right. Yep. I think they're Crown, right?
I'm not sure.
Or Seagram's, one or the other, maybe both. But yes, the Brofmans. All your Jewish,
Seagram's.
yeah, all your Jewish mafia from the Pale of Settlements. That goes right back. It's like a circle.
Yes.
Okay.
There's sort of one element of the organized crime thing. You got the Yakuza, and they're like so close to the government. So yeah, basically that's like Peter Dale Scott, deep politics. You know, you got the corporations, the intelligence agencies, and organized crime, and that sort of creates this whole area of all the things we can't talk about, and now we're covering it up, and so that's why like 90% of everything is classified, and people live in sort of a dream world, because it's sort of like they sort of get the simplistic view of good versus evil, and you know, a cop on these TV shows would never be a dirty cop usually, or like they would never accept bribes, even if, like, say, in many cities it would be like quite normal for most of the police to take bribes.
Right.
Or for like people used to know that like everything was corrupt and it was controlled by a machine politics, but like once they got television, they managed to convince everybody, you know, it's all innocent, and you know, anybody who talks about it's just a conspiracy theorist.
Right. So does anybody have any questions for our guest? I see Guru. Let me bring him up. Guru is from Australia.
Okay.
Got a question or a comment?
I'm just trying to listen away, and I'm having sorts of spaces. I've cleared my phone and that, as far as I know. And yeah, so I was just asking for a mic so I could actually listen to the conversation. Colonel, if that's fine for the moment.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I'm glad to have you here.
You.
Sure. Yeah, just so that you know, Hugo, our spaces are targeted. There's always sound issues. Most people have to come back and listen to the recording because they are attacked nonstop. I get dropped from my own spaces all the time because no one seems to like us talking about this stuff.
Yeah, or it's just like Twitter is like censoring me since like 2016, basically. Like I used to get like thousands of hits a day, and then like as soon as Russiagate happened, it went down to like 500.
Well,
so I'm like, lucky if I get like 700 a day or whatever. Where I used to really get like 4,000 because of like the algorithms. It just,
and
all the media is censored and like controlled, and just sort of they can't have the internet because they can't have just everybody allowed to, you know, research and write. It could be dangerous.
And that's what Bridget has found out about our account here, is that when we had like 300 or 400 people, we had way more people looking at our post. We now have like 23,000, and we get less than we did when we had 300 or 400. It's the craziest thing that I have ever seen. And I just had someone today DM me saying that every time he goes to our page, that he can't see anything except for the last post that I made. The rest of the entire page is invisible. So
I have the same problem. And even the glitches are not okay. People will go in and out of spaces, all sorts of spaces, all during the day. We have some people that, you know, spend a lot of time on X, and they don't have any problems, but they come into ours and the sound drops, or they'll hear every fourth word, or so on.
Yeah, so it is a conscious effort by somebody to make sure that accurate history does not get portrayed to the masses. So all along, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. Interesting program today. I just wanted to pick up on something Hugo said about the strategic facet of this whole when he was talking about Dugganism. I mean, I think there's an extent to which you can, if you look also from like the British planners or whatnot, and I think to some extent some parts of Wall Street, they just had this strategic goal that they were going to do anything come hell and high water to prevent an alliance between Germany and Russia, and whether it be Russia or the Soviet Union didn't really matter. I mean, in other words, there was a sense to which that strategic objective of preventing a German and Russian alliance superseded all of the ideologies. And, after that, whatever ideological mix you wanted to throw in there would be, significant factions in England and the US who were going to back that for strategic reasons. And the ideology was almost like, an advertising campaign. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those strategic objectives of factions of U.S. and British banking were necessarily the cause of the fundamental change, but they were definitely an ingredient.
That's definitely a major element of like the history of like the great power things, is that they're very concerned that if you had the German industrial base and like having access to all the Russian natural resources, that they would completely, dominate the world basically. And so like Russia alone was almost able to dominate like half of Europe. And obviously they were aligned to say Germany, a friendly Germany, they could have probably conquered the world. And that's true. And of course, even today, that a major goal of provoking the Ukraine war was to keep Germany is like the biggest investor. It was the biggest investor in Russia, basically. And so they wanted to prevent friendly relations between Germany and Russia. And once Russia invaded, it's like, you cannot associate with these horrible barbarians that are conquering Ukraine. And so Germany went the other way. Of course, they still complain about Germany on these most of these think tanker people on the Ukraine war, like Michael Kaufman and like Rob and stuff. That Germany, they're not doing enough. They're never doing enough. But from the Russian perspective, they did like a complete 180 of being like completely hostile once Russia invaded.
Guru, go ahead.
I'm just thinking in the background here, listening to the conversation. Colonel, it'd be good to do an experiment here because your spaces have gone down incredibly in volume and there's no reason for that, right? This is one of the most interesting, backstories on the internet about where we are today and factual. So I'm thinking, and now sorry to break the conversation here, I just wanted to get this out before I go. We got a bit of a day today, but I'm just thinking maybe if you didn't put Operation Gladio and maybe if you didn't use Colonel Towner and you got someone to host the space and they put in something different, like don't come in here to learn about anything important or something, and just see how many people you pull. Because for you to pull 23 people in here is just absolutely ridiculous, Colonel. I've been here for a long time now and I've watched your numbers drop under algorithms attack, I would say. So is it worth doing a little experiment on one of these and just see if we can punch it back up to, and then send that information off to Elon, going, right, what the hell's going on, Elon?
No, you're right.
No, I just had a thought I had, Colonel.
God, I love you, Guru. You're absolutely right, because there used to be 200 or 300 people in here at a time. And the more it's attacked, the more it happens. And so I do think you're right. I think we will change the name and we'll kind of do like a undercover operation. And we're going to figure out whether or not that's the deal. Because honestly, Guru, you're a brainiac, because I was just having a conversation yesterday about the term Operation Gladio. There's something about that term that scares the living shit out of everybody. And because once you get that, everything else is on your own. You can find everything about your history if you start searching on Operation Gladio, just like we did. We're not any different than every one of you. We just had the time to do the research and bring it to you. And I made the comment to the person I was talking about to yesterday that I found it awful odd that even people that will come to me and DM me and ask me for where am I getting all my information, they will then go and they have hundreds of thousands of viewers, but they will never use that word, Operation Gladio. They talk about all this shit to some degree in a very limited hangout way, but they will never use that term. So I think you're absolutely right, Guru. All along, go ahead. All along?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Guru. You had something else?
No, I was just saying, let's do it. And if you need to fall back on me, I haven't hosted any spaces for a long time. Not that, but yeah, if you want to try and find someone, and you know what I mean.
Yes, I will.
That's what I think would be a good idea. Even with someone else to host it, and have you come in, but don't put anything in the titles. And I'll bet you, maybe not me, because we'll pull a few people on. Yeah, sorry, but yeah, we'll pull a few people in, you know what I mean? Just because maybe I'm sitting here and the Aussies will rock in. That's not what we want to do. Yeah, what we want to do is sit it with somebody else, you know
Yes.
what I mean? And then see what happens when people go, oh, it's getting bang, and then it starts getting shared out. Because I reckon they're holding your numbers back. I come into this space, Colonel, I was just not hearing anything, and I'm going, right, I'll go out, I'll come back in. I'll go out, I'll come back in. And then as soon as I've asked for a mic, I seem to be okay. I can hear the whole conversation, nothing's dropping out. And that happens to me a fair bit in spaces. So that could be my personal attack, what they do to me. Unless I've got a mic, I can't listen. But yeah, I just think that we could prove a point here and then use that maybe.
No, I get that comment all the time. There's people that there will be people that DM me that are probably in my DMs right now. I just don't look at them while I'm on, that says I tried and I can't get in and I can't hear you. Every day that happens.
Also, people could get headphones, like good headphones. It is quieter unless you're a speaker. I noticed, like when it was like a bit quieter before I got the mic, but I could still hear it because I was wearing like nice headphones.
Yeah, no, it has nothing.
Gladio, though, there's a great story about one of the more reformist CIA directors, Stanfield Turner, who fired a bunch of the dirtiest people and is hated. And there's obviously a different kind of backstory to that. But anyways, he was on Italian TV and they asked him about Gladio, and he immediately said "fuck you" and stormed out of the interview.
Oh, now we just covered Stanfield Turner and the Jimmy Carter and the Halloween Massacre and all of that. I have never heard that story though. Where did you hear that?
I don't remember where I read that, but I definitely remember that. And I also, by the way, I was born the night of the Halloween Massacre. So it's sort of my mind. It's kind of my destiny to screw with the CIA.
Oh, well, I have a similar story, Hugo. My birthday is April 19th, and that's the entry into the 10 days of some satanic ritual death thing for 10 days starting on the 19th, which is why Waco and Oklahoma and all that shit happens on the 19th all the time.
That's interesting.
Yeah. All along, go ahead.
Colonel, this is kind of speculative, but I've noticed a pattern where for a long, long time, what I call the so-called left, or the controlled left, or in the CIA's phrase, the compatible left, has really shied away from what was once called national security state history. And then more recently, Trump supporters and, not strictly Trump supporters, but people associated with the right, for better or worse, because we know those terms can be deceptive, have sort of picked up that football that the purported left is not really allowed to go to. In fact, has disinformation people like Noam Chomsky who just fervently dissuade the U.S.-controlled left from ever looking at the national security state, which name was changed to deep state. So is it possible that your space, by looking at, the national security state / deep state and getting, people, who are not really necessarily political leaders of the Democrats and Republicans and might not be completely aligned in that sort of scissor blade mentality, is it possible that this space, might be a target for that reason, that it kind of undermines the sort of scissor blade dualism of the Democrats and Republicans and enables the people of the United States to honestly talk about what the CIA has been doing for 50 years, independent of these two scissor blades called the Democrats and Republicans? I think it's possible that powers that be might not really find that all too groovy, as it were.
So I definitely think that is a descriptive way of saying that we're being shadow banned. And for that reason, again, my personal opinion, people that I know about Operation Gladio refuse to use that particular term, because I spent, and just for you guys to know, I have 2 master's degrees. I spent 30 years inside of this system. I have a library that is hundreds of books big that I have all read. I've read all of them. And I never knew about Operation Gladio. I read things just to read things, to learn history, I thought. And in doing that, I had a whole bunch of information, but it just rattled around in my head. It didn't actually form any logical conclusions. I didn't notice patterns, nothing. It was just info. It was not until I stumbled across Operation Gladio and we started digging into it and was able, using those terms, Operation Gladio, then you come across the term paramilitary, so you add that to the search. Then you come across CIA coups, which there are many, and you start adding these words to your search engine, and your entire world blows up. Because all of a sudden, you can find all of them. You can find all of the Operation Gladio, you find World Anti-Communist League, you find the World Wildlife Fund, you find UNESCO. It just literally blows up and it all makes sense. And that's what I think they fear of normal Americans doing what we just did. Did you have something you wanted to say, Hugo?
Yeah, I was going to say, also, in addition to Operation Gladio, you should definitely study Operation Condor and study the Phoenix program. And it's like, I found that like between those 3, you get like a great view of how these covert operations and deep state things work.
So Hugo,
there's this book called Predatory States by J.P. McSherry. If people haven't read, definitely read that.
Yeah.
It's like Doug Valentine, and of course Doug Valentine's the Phoenix program.
So
that in depth.
Yeah, we actually went through Doug Valentine's book here. And we did just about every coup of Operation Condor. When we started this, when we moved, we were over on Truth Social. When we moved it over to X, we started basically a round the world tour, and we started in South America and Central America. And then we moved to the Caribbean, and then we moved to Europe, and then we moved to Africa, and then we moved to Asia. We spent probably a week and a half on Vietnam, half of that material came from Doug Valentine's book, about the Phoenix program. I'm a very big fan of his material, not his political outlook. But he is an excellent researcher. There's probably not anyone that spent more time in that area talking to more of the actual CIA operators that did what they did there. And I just did a piece today, a very long thread about the Operation Gladio the Operation Phoenix program used in Central America between Honduras, El Salvador, and Costa Rica against Nicaragua. I mean, they implemented it to a T. As a matter of fact, I've even made the analogy that 9/11 brought the Phoenix program here. That's what FEMA is. FEMA, with their territorial things and their the sectors that they set up. If you were to, and I did a post where I compared all of the things that the FEMA and the legislation after the Patriot Act after 9/11, it set up the Phoenix program infrastructure inside the United States.
Yeah, Doug Valentine also said that. I said it too, I'm sure. But yeah, definitely. I just sort of take a more random approach to sort of like, what am I interested in, and then I study it for way too long or whatever. What's cool that you guys did is sort of a step-by-step around the world tour version, and that you already have studied the physics program and Operation Condor. Because I think if you study those all three in conjunction, then you understand how counterinsurgency dirty war works. Which it's a mild version is in the U.S. right now. And one of my early articles is like America's global military empire, where North America is also one of these sectors, like North Cobb, and if people ever rise up, of course they will start torturing and killing and using all this NSA data that they've been collecting on us. And I'm sure.
Well, I think that
list of people to round up to send to these.
Well, I think the January 6th people would tell you it's already here. Yeah, the January 6th people would tell you that the torture's already here, the roundup is already here.
Oh yeah, of course, and I'm black, so I can tell you, of course.
Yeah.
Torture people. That's why they sent police to train torturers in Latin America.
Yes, exactly.
Colonel, I also think, we saw to some extent a preview of that with the military intelligence groups in the late 1960s, where, you had General Yarborough in Colombia doing the Macarena already there in 1961. And then, as some researchers have argued, he was involved in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. So,
right. Yep. Yeah. Unfortunately, we have a lot of that overlap there, as you point out. Okay. Cousin It, did you have anything else you wanted to add? Quit texting me and talk.
I couldn't get the mic to work. No, but I did want to again thank Hugo for coming. For those of you who'd like more information, Hugo has a lot of his work linked on his profile. So if you would like to learn more about
it's all free. Antiimperialistu.blogspot.com, whatever. I don't charge anything or ask for anybody.
Yeah, and
it's free.
It is a wealth of information, and certainly for those of you who want more information on Ukraine and Russia, because there was a big hole in my education, and of course we're limited to what we're able to find, and X still won't let you post a lot of the Russian newspapers, keeping that in mind. But Hugo's a channel blog is truly a wealth of information for anybody looking to find out more. And again, thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate it.
You can also find more reader-friendly versions of my work at Libya 360, which also does a lot of international news from sort of allegedly, but definitely not averse to looking at things from the conspiracy, not averse to looking at Gladio Beat, stuff like that, run by my friend, Alexandra Valiente. So, and my new one will be coming soon, hopefully. I'm waiting for my editor to get it out. But.
And definitely you guys go follow him on X. A wealth of information, obviously, interested in all of the same stuff that we're interested in. And definitely need to support people that are doing the yeoman's work as far as researching and digging out the truth for all of us. Bridget, go ahead.
And it's also, it's interesting that we're from I'm definitely on the opposite sides of the ideological spectrum, but because we've done the same research, we have many elements of our analysis of the world situation.
But Hugo, that's the same thing that I felt about Doug Valentine. We're definitely don't have to agree on everything. But the one thing that you cannot do is you can't change history. History is history, and we need to all understand it and process it as actual information. We'll draw different conclusions based on the history potentially, but we shouldn't be arguing and allowing these assholes to separate us and stop us from talking about what our shared history is, because that's how they manipulate us.
Yes, and just keep researching, and it is fascinating. But the problem is that people don't know what they don't know, so it's I'm studying this, and they think it's just some boring nonsense. They don't want to hear about it and whatever. But it's just it's just so fascinatingly shocking, the history of the past 80 years.
Yeah, their worst fear is you and I talking.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bridget.
It was fun.
Yeah,
Thanks
Bridget, go. I think
Cousin It is the one who got me to come on the show. So thanks for
Cousin It is our PR person. She's an amazing. She reaches out to people that she knows our audience will embrace as far as their research and their knowledge, and that adds to the diversity of the material that we bring, and we love her.
And I'm friends with Doug Valentine, but he pissed me off too with his he supports Russia Gate, and he was even saying oh, we should stop selling JFK because we're never going to solve it. It's are you joking?
Yeah, I learned early on when I was a major in doing just reading. I've always read nonfiction, that when I was assigned to U.S. Central Command, I got some very wise advice from a 2-star that said, you have to read both sides of every conflict, because if you don't, you'll never know the truth.
Absolutely.
And
that's what I do with Ukraine.
Yes, exactly. And if you don't read everything that people write about these situations, then you are not doing the truth justice, because you can research their references and figure out whether they're even just the tone. One of the things he pointed out to me, which I found fascinating, when you read supposed historical events, when people, and this is kind of the thing that I found Doug Valentine guilty of, and it clearly shows after you've read, several hundred books, when people use, there's certain parts of a historical research project called a book that you are going to, and I do it as well when I present my information, you're going to draw conclusions. Like we talk about patterns based on the research material that you've gathered up. So you're going to have some takeaways at the end. Those takeaways are your opinions of the material. When you're presenting the material in the middle of your book, what you should never do is use emotionally triggered words in describing events. And one of the things that he pointed out to me, because of course CENTCOM was our AOR that included most of everything except for Israel in the Middle East and the Horn of Africa. And so obviously we were dealing with a lot of the Palestinian type issues in the Middle East and Syria and Saudi Arabia and blah, blah, blah. Well, anytime that you read a Palestinian, a book about Palestine, there were emotionally charged words, not just facts. And you could tell that the reader was being manipulated based on the choice of words. And as a discipline researcher and a discipline reader of nonfiction, you have to pay attention to the material that you're reading to not allow yourself to be taken by those words. And Doug Valentine's is a very good example of that, because he adamantly hates Trump and somehow managed in a book about the Southeast Asia to weave him constantly into the narrative. And when you do that, you're not doing yourself any favors.
Yeah, I would agree that his hatred of Trump has sort of screwed up his view of the world, basically. It's like that Russiagate is like, there's no proof that there's any intelligence involvement in Russiagate. It's like, how can you say that? Every aspect of it,
yes,
like intelligence agency.
Yeah, and it just, again, he's an excellent researcher, and it just distracts from the wonderful information. Yeah,
I think you have to do agitprop and sort of take a side too, and people need to be fired up, and it's probably artists are you have to be, you're always somewhat of a propagandist, and every history is never totally objective. But I think you should try to think objectively, but maybe also sometimes be able to write subjectively sometimes, because you're battling evil and apathetic.
Yeah, and that's what we specifically do on our space here and any of the shows that I'm on. We are very careful to separate, here's the actual information and here's my speculation as to what it means.
Yeah, that's a good practice.
Yeah. So anyway, and I try to the best of my ability to stay away from speculation in general, because our job is to give information to people and allow them to form their own conclusions.
Yeah.
So having said that, do you have any closing thoughts for us, Hugo? Again, everybody go follow him, support his work. And we're going to let you close it out, Hugo. And thank you again for being here. We really, really appreciate it.
Just keep up the research on Ukraine. Just the only real thing America can do is to cut Ukraine off. But I think under the Trump peace plan, they're actually going to end up saying like, oh, we want to make peace, so we're going to send Ukraine a bunch of weapons so that they can improve the negotiating position. And it's a dangerous situation, and and Trump supporters are trying to restrain these Ukrainians that actually want nuclear war. That's one thing about Stetsko, is he actually wanted a nuclear war during the Cold War. And today these Ukrainians are constantly saying, Putin's just bluffing. Let us do whatever we want. Let us get a nuke. Let us have Tomahawk cruise missiles so we can fire like 1,000 miles into Russia. And Russia's, it never really makes sense to bluff the world, but you can only push something so far until it does happen, and they should probably relax. That's all I have to say.
Okay. And thank you again. You're welcome back here anytime. If you come across anything and you want to share, just reach out to Cousin It or myself, and we'd love to have you back on. Obviously, a lot of our research overlaps with each other. And we would like to have you on, every couple months or something like that, just so you could catch us up on what your latest project is.
I might show up again. It's sometimes hard when I'm involved in research and work and stuff, but I think I could definitely try to make it again.
Yeah, we would love to have you. Thank you so much for being here. And thanks everybody for being here. Yeah. We will be back on Monday. And again, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks. Okay, guys, that was a lot. I'm mentally exhausted. Hugo's links. Okay, let me find them for you real quick. Hugo's links is at I'll go ahead and type it in so you guys have it, and then it's here as a record at Hugo Turner, 1969, at Hugo Turner, 1969. All right, so there is his handle on X. He also has a blog called anti-imperialist-u period blogspot, one word, .com. And yeah, definitely an interesting guy. And I highly recommend following him. So he's done a lot of research into fascism in general in Ukraine, specifically, as Cousin It said. So thank you guys for being here. Appreciate it. Take care.